Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to our session on Islamism and Islamist political movements. This one discussing a fascinating research paper by Hamzeh Al-Moustafa. The paper is entitled Assessing the Impact of Political Engagement on Syria's Islamist Factions, the Appraisal of the Transformations of Ahrar al-Sham, Jaysh al-Islam and Faylaq al-Sham. Hamzeh, who I am a big fan of his works, is a PhD candidate in the Middle East politics at the University of Exeter, my former university. And he's an assistant researcher at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. He holds a master's degree in political science and international relations from my current university, the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. And he has published many peer-reviewed research and book titles, and a book actually entitled Virtual Public Sphere in the Syrian Revolution. He also published two excellent forthcoming book chapters coming out of our unit in ACRIPS, the Strategic Studies unit. One in the book called Bullets to Ballots, and he focuses as well on Syrian transformations, and a forthcoming one on a book about combat effectiveness, where he focuses on the combat effectiveness of Jabhat al-Nusra, and now HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So I have to say a couple of things about Hamzeh's work, which again I am a very big fan of. First, it's quite interdisciplinary in many ways. It covers elements, theories, approaches from security studies, conflict studies, political science, sociology, history. And I'm really fascinated by the depth of his knowledge on the empirical side, especially on the Syrian case. So very deep in that sense on one end, but also the breadth of the theories and its interdisciplinarity is quite unique. And the other thing that I'm very excited about, and specifically with this paper and his work as well previously in book chapters, and hopefully this becomes a forthcoming book, is it says something new about de-radicalization and about transformations in general. So the books that basically in 2009 there was like the main books that addressed de-radicalization or collective and individual de-radicalization processes. Hogan's book in I think it was 2009. Barrett and Bukhari's book in 2009 as well, and mine in 2009. All of them came at the same time, two addressing the individual de-radicalization processes, one addressing the collective de-radicalization processes, followed in 2010 by Rand's seminal study, which covered, it was entitled, I think, is De-Radicalizing Islamist Extremists, and it was more or less surveying what's in the field for about 40 years on this topic of de-radicalization, and the works of the late Chris Bowshek, who wrote on individual de-radicalization in Saudi Arabia and in Yemen, in the Saudi Arabian program and the Yemeni programs. And since then, everything was more or less either reaction to these works or attempted refinement of these works, but nothing, breaking. I think what Hamzeh is going to produce eventually is kind of a breakthrough in that subject, and it's focusing primarily on transformations while holding arms. We all focused previously on transformations after abandoning arms, or the process of abandoning arms, delegitimizing the armed path on ideological and narrativistic basis, abandoning political violence behaviorally, and dismantling the capacity to use arms organizationally. And now Hamzeh is taking this as, you maintain the capacity, but you change the ideology and the behavior, and perhaps, abandon the capacity at a later stage. But anyway, I don't want to say any more. I sang your praises, Hamzeh, so, and now I'm going to leave the floor to you, no pressure, The floor is all yours now to speak to us about this fascinating research paper, and I will give you, you'll have about 25 minutes, and then I will comment a bit, and then followed by the comments of Hassan Obaid, and then we'll open up for the Q&A. So without any further ado, the floor is yours, Hamzeh.
Thank you so much, Dr. Omar. You know how big fan I am, and I learned a lot from your work, and it's very essential for any student who want to study transformation within Islamist movement. And I'm sorry, I wrote my presentation in English, so not like Dr. Hassan, I'm gonna have to combine between English and Arabic, but mainly I'm gonna speak in English. And also I'm sorry because I changed the title of my research. Now I'm talking from Islamism to Post-Islamism, transformation within the armed Syrian movement in Syria. As Dr. Omar Ashur said, that's maybe the special things about my paper that I'm investigating, I'm examining transformation under continuity, not with the simple cases, not the complex cases like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, al-Nahda in Tunisia, or something like that. However, I'm gonna to start with the brief about or background about Syria in general and about Islamist movement in Syria and the emergence of the new armed Islamist movement in Syria after the revolution. Before speaking about the theoretical approaches that use commonly to examine the transformation within Islamist movement. As you know, Syria under the former President Hafez al-Assad and subsequently under his son Bashar al-Assad has experienced an authoritarianism that changed the political landscape and resulted in the disappearance of diverse political life, or killing politics, as Lisa Wedin says in her book, Ambiguity of Domination. Given this background, it was unsurprising that many scholars, many analysts predict that the Arab Spring would not extend to Syria. This prediction has been built on what is known in the Syrian study as a Hamar rule. That is, any rebellion will face the same brutal fate of the Islamist insurgency of 1980s. However, as anticipated, that Hamar rules, as you know, all of us, we know that Hamar rules have prevailed nationwide with the intense violence deployed to suppress the protest and the armed insurgency after 2011. However, despite its resilience, there is a near agreement that the Syrian regime since 2011 has lost the capacity to enjoy an exclusive control of political process in the country. In other words, the Syrian revolution paved the way for opponents of the regime in general, and Islamists in particular, to make a dramatic return to political life after a decade of exclusion. To borrow from Jürgen Habermas, to borrow a term from Jürgen Habermas, it can be said that the Syrian revolution created a new public sphere that freed the opposition from regime repression and allowed both political and social actors to present their idea, vision, and platform. Here, Syria, and for its first time in the modern history, that experienced the development of numerous armed Islamist groups, which since 2014 have been at the center of the armed struggle against the Syrian regime, as well as the foreign-backed militia such as Hezbollah and Iraq and Iranian forces. And like their counterpart in Egypt, for example, in Tunisia, who assumed power through election, at least temporarily, Islamists in Syria tried sought to seize the opportunity to play a key role in shaping the dynamic of the political landscape. Here, a great deal of scholars who attempt to understand the Syrian conflict focus on the rise of Islamism and development of Syrian jihadism. However, most of them have concentrated on a global jihadist movement rather than or at the expense of the local Islamist movement, despite their crucial role in shaping the dynamic of conflict. And also the scholar who addressed the local Islamist movement tried to focus on the establishment of this group, or at least their path toward radicalization, rather than their subsequent transformation. I mean here, de-radicalization and moderation. In this context, my study, or I'm trying to bridge the gap in the literature by concentrating on the local Islamist movement in Syria first, and try to examine their transformation, radicalization, de-radicalization, and moderation. To do so, I have chosen three Islamist movements: Ahrar al-Sham and Jaysh al-Islam and Faylaq al-Sham, by entering their black books through conducting an in-depth interview with their political and military leader, grassroots supporter, competitors. My study tried to answer this following question: what the mechanism of a change by which Syrian armed Islamist movement have transformed their ideology, behavior, and organizational structure during the revolution war. Of course, there are several sub-questions related to transformative dynamics, reversing factor, and for example, how do this movement respond to the external political environment, how to mobilize their resources and construct their organization, frame their ideology, all of these. And the selection of the cases has several motivation. First of all, Ahrar al-Sham and Jaysh al-Islam and Faylaq al-Sham is considered as the most powerful and the most prominent and best organized movement in the Syrian opposition. Secondly, they enjoyed a kind of support in area hosting them, and they set up a kind of autonomous administration. And thirdly, their theaters of operation are limited to Syria with non-institutional link to any non-Syrian group such as Jabhat al-Nusra or ISIS, for example. And fourthly, they are essentially a radical group as they aim to establish a purely Islamic state, and they have been a subject for different transformations since 2011. And finally, and most importantly, because they belong to different school of thought and ideological current. For example, Ahrar al-Sham is an extension of national Salafi jihadism in Syria, while Jaysh al-Islam gave an expression of the scholarly Salafi Wahhabism in Syria, while Faylaq al-Sham has emerged based on the accumulated experience of the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. So by focusing on this model and examining similarities and differences, I think we can draw a clear picture about the revival of Islamism in Syria first, and to investigate or to to know the motivation behind the transformation within the armed Islamist movement, either in Syria or outside Syria in the same context. So, as exploring mechanism of change remain the main objective of my study, I have chosen political process theory or political process approach as a theoretical framework. I will explain later why I have chosen this approach that emerged in response to socio-economic and psychological approaches of social movement theory. Why it's suitable to my study, which, as I said before, try to examine transformation under continuity. So within this context, by using political process approach, I argue that the transformation, the behavioral, organizational, and ideological transformation within the armed Islamist movement have determined by the interaction between three main dimensions: the external political environment, like this, you can read the hypothesis here, and the mobilization structure, resources and mobilization structure, and ideological frame. And I will explain later in details why, how I develop this hypothesis and how I develop my theoretical framework. But in quick, regarding to research methodology and method, I'm employing a qualitative comparative approach based on case study. It will be built on in field work. I'm using semi-structural interview with the both content and discourse analysis of interviewing data and written and spoken record of this movement. Here, in the second part in my presentation, I'm gonna focus quickly about the theoretical approaches that's used to examine transformation within Islamist movement from various disciplines. But before, I'm gonna to define the three main processes within this used to study the transformation of Islamist movement. First of all, radicalization, and Dr. Omar Ashur wrote a lot about radicalization and de-radicalization, but I'm using a simple definition that radicalization is an escalation processes leading to violence. By contrast, de-radicalization, the reversal of dynamic or renouncing violence, while moderation is associated with the embarrassing democratic and practice and value. Regarding to the theoretical approaches toward radicalization, a scholar usually or largely use the structural psychological approach that's based on relative deprivation theory, which emphasizes on the social structural strain. Within this approach, there are three main frameworks I can say here: socioeconomic and political and cultural. The socioeconomic framework wrote the adaptation of radical attitude in the effect of economic deprivation, poverty, unemployment, marginalization, corruption, or something like that. And this framework have been used widely, but despite its importance, it's also criticized for example, he has failed to answer many questions. For example, why people living in good economic condition or in developed country, for example, have joined the jihadist or Islamist group, or sometimes joined the terroristic group. So to avoid this explanatory gap, or the explanatory gap of socioeconomic framework, frustration aggression theory has been used to emphasize the importance of political factor. Frustration, this theory deal with the radicalization as a direct consequences of individual frustration, which may interact with the general feeling of political alienation at the national level. However, the literature, for example, bring two main criticism for this theory. The first one, it's individual centric. The second one is deal with the radicalization as a reaction, ignoring that the radicalization, it might be an intentional or strategic act. In this regard, also repression aggression theory, which focus or which emphasize state exclusion as a source and the cause of radicalization, also have been used, but cannot explain everything regarding to this issue. And the last structural psychological framework is, we can call it identity theory or cultural, which focus on cultural factor and attributing a kind of or a significant role of Islamic textual sources in interpreting this the radicalization at both micro and macro level. And also political process approach have been used to study, to examine de-radicalization, and I'm gonna talk about this later.
Hamza, just to avoid frustration radicalization, just, you know, you have 10 minutes, so you know, be careful with that.
Okay, maybe I'm going to explain my theoretical framework more than during the discussion, but now I'm gonna quickly focus on
go through it quickly, but just bear in mind it's you know, we have about 10 minutes, I think, and they're warning me already.
Yeah, very quickly, that the literature on de-radicalization usually distinguish between two main processes of de-radicalization: individual focused de-radicalization and group focused de-radicalization. The individual focused de-radicalization tend to happen in several stages. For example, here I'm using the RAND study, a trigger which could be a painful event or emotional crisis, usually opens door for cognitive doubt about staying in the radical group. Push and pull factor, which refer to personal analysis of the cost and benefit about staying in the radical group. The turning point here, when the benefit of leaving exceed the benefit of remaining. This engagement. Some scholars usually use the disengagement in the same meaning of de-radicalization, but maybe at the individual level here is different. This engagement here, when the decision to leave the radical group is made, and de-radicalization refer to reintegration, the de facto, into society with a new identity that might help them to avoid rejoining the radical group again. Here, I'm a big fan of your works, Dr. عاشور, and I think it's the most important or the key reference in understanding the de-radicalization process or the collective de-radicalization. Dr. Omar عاشور focused on 4 variables to understand the de-radicalization process: historical and charismatic leadership, state repression, and Dr. Hassan talk about this this issue, and I'm gonna talk about this issue also when discussing the exclusion moderation theory, selective motivation and social interaction within and outside organization. Dr. عاشور used this framework to understand the causal mechanism, or why Islamist movement get de-radicalized. And I'm gonna move quickly to moderation thesis. Here we can differentiate between two main theses. Dr. Omar Ashur in his work talk about 4. I'm gonna talk only about 2. The first one, inclusion through moderation. The structure of this thesis has built on the idea of trade-off between modernization and participation that theorized by Sumail Huntington in his book, The Third Wave. These theses draw on the experience of the Western Christian and Communist Party and try to apply their conclusion to the Islamist Party. It's assumed that the encouraging Islamist movement, for example, to run in an election and participate in political process, will lead to a behavioral moderation, which in turn will lead to ideological moderation, and we can talk about this later. And from this perspective, moderation through inclusion usually focus on 2 conditions: democratic center or institutional democratic center, or semi-democratic democratic center, and structural opportunity or political opportunity structure, as Dr. Hussein highlighted in his presentation. But the main criticism of the inclusion moderation theory, that's drawing on the experience of in the Arab world, for example, and in the Middle East, that many or the majority of Islamist movement have adopted the behavioral moderation. Why they were not tolerant with reviewing their core ideology. So this is the dilemma here of the moderation through inclusion, and this is why the advocator of exclusion moderation theory claimed that imposing constraint on the radical Islamist movement will encourage them to rethink or to critically rethink their behavior and reformulate their ideology. And this thesis has built in 2 assumptions: cultural and sociopolitical assumption. The cultural side of this thesis is based on the Orientalist presumption of incompatibility between democracy and Islam, while the socio-political part claims that inclusion may offer an opportunity for Islamists to spread their or their damaged ideology. So exclusion, on the other hand, will convince the leader and member of Islamist movement that their radical ideology has not attained any concrete result. So they have to choose another behavioral and ideological way. However, the main criticism of this thesis that it promotes the violence, as well as we cannot determine what kind of violence or how much violence should be applied to, for example, to encourage or to motivate Islamists to become moderate or something like that. But after this is the last thesis in the theoretical framework that's used to study Islamist movement. But after reviewing, in my paper, after reviewing all or the most theoretical approach, I delivered some shortcoming. Quickly, I'm gonna say that's first of all, most of these approaches proceeding from normative assumption. And they deal with the Islamist as either extremist or they carry the seed of extremism. For the second issue, that they are interested in exploring the causes rather than the mechanism, or rather than the interaction within the movement and the interaction between the movement and its context. Some of them are specific to particular type of Islamist movement. For example, why moderation is suitable with the movement in a political arena. De-radicalization and radicalization is more compatible with the Islamist movement in political, in a violent and protest arena. The fourth issue that most of them emphasize on inventable outcome, that they, for example, they are interested how this movement become moderate or de-radicalized rather than the dynamics and the mechanism and different way to moderation or to de-radicalization. And last thing that they assume that the transformation of the bus to try, there is a linear or unidirectional bus to the outcome of transformation, which the experiences regarding in Egypt or in the other Arab world that proved that the transformation usually multi-directional, and sometimes you have 3 or 4 3 processes at the same way. In this issue, because I'm studying armed Islamist movement.
Hamzeh, I'm really sorry, but you know we're almost run out of time, so I'll give you 3 minutes just to wrap up and conclude.
Because maybe I will explain later.
Then we'll come back in the Q&A. Yeah, sure.
The discussion, because I'm studying, as I said before, because I'm studying armed Islamist movement, and because I'm studying transformation under continuity, I have chosen political process approach because it can help me, for example, to study this movement as a social movement, to study as the first things, and I can, for example, highlight the micro and macro and economic and meso level as well. I could very quickly, the external political environment here, we can, for example, differentiate between open and closed environment, and how the movement respond, and how to build their organization in response to the political environment, especially in repressive environments such as Syria. Here, the resources and mobilization structure, also the other dimension which deal with these Islamists as the rational actors, and within this perspective, I can also, for example, I can external sponsorship. I can focus about the importance of the resources, about the pre-war networking, about the international factors, especially in the Syrian case, for example, the state sponsor playing a crucial role in determining the transformation within the 3 selected cases. And the ideological frame, I'm trying to differentiate. I've tried to differentiate between frames and the framing process, and how the frame transform based on no explanation of the framing process. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hamzeh. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
All good. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for that. It's fascinating work. I really look forward to reading it in print. And I really look forward to reading the book that will come out of it in print, not just the PhD thesis. I will have to briefly comment before I introduce and leave the floor to Dr. Hassan. So just you know, maybe a few comments, and I'll send you the rest in writing. But the one issue is the normative dimension that you refer to. I think what makes the thesis quite unique is that you are looking at what you call the transformation under continuity, which means transformation while the combat is happening, while carrying arms, while being involved in the middle of a civil war. So it's very fascinating in that sense, because as far as I remember, there's not much out there, especially in the case of of Syria. But you were right about the normative bias, because the reason this happened, I think Dr. Azmi Bishara referred to this in his introductory remarks in the Bullets to Ballots conference, the transformation from armed to unarmed activism. He was saying basically we're all, at least whoever works on this, the scholars who work on this transformation process, are biased towards peace. So they want to see peace happening. They want to see an end to political violence. Most of the literature that happened on radicalization and de-radicalization happened after 9/11, and there the debate was kinetic versus non-kinetic. You know, they use counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, even traditional warfare methods, or use methods that attempt to transform these groups, these armed groups, into either unarmed political parties or unarmed social movements. So the centrism here was combat versus non-combat, war versus peace. So that's why we have this bias, and obviously most of the scholars will go for towards the soft side. So and this is what happened. We produced a body of literature that is initially biased without looking at what's happening. Let's say there was no peace. The combat is still going on. So what happens now under these conditions? So that's why I think it's quite unique and fascinating piece of work you're doing. So that's one issue. Another issue is regarding the. It's in defense of Ted Robert Gurr, like the Why Men Rebel. He has a piece. It's an interview actually called "Why Men Rebel Redux." So he's basically revising his theories on relative deprivation and so on. And part of that, he was saying that he produced the work in a specific time frame. Back in it was published in 1970. The work was done, during the Vietnam War between 65 and 70. So that's, I think, the time frame influenced the line of the work. But if we revised, what he said is still relevant to many cases. It's explained in many cases, but as you noted, it just deviates quite a bit from the structural psychological approaches. Don't explain everything anymore. There's so much going on. So they did explain transformations in historical perspective, but not. But there are many cases that just challenge the theory in general. One thing, just be careful between theories and approaches, two different terms. So put structural psychological approaches. It's not a theory, so be careful with distinguishing the terms. Very briefly, also, this is a revision of my works and some reflection on it. What I did was trying to explain why the initiation happens and why does it succeed. So, the interaction between the major variables you refer to, leadership, repression or pressure of the combat, the armed path, selective inducements, interactions, and so on. This is like interactions to explain the initiation mean. The issue here, which is quite relevant I think in the Syrian case, is that how to sustain it, because you can initiate the process of de-radicalization and then it collapses on your head. It happened in many places. Lately in Colombia, with the case of the FARC, signed a peace deal and then there's no sustainability, so it collapses. So what's happening is that when you look at the sustainability, you need to look at the macro level, because what we're talking about here is the meso-level variables. So variables that belong to the organization and the leadership of the organization, the inducements given to the organization. So the organization is the unit of analysis. You can apply the same thing on the institution, on the state-affiliated institution. Leadership needs to be there, inducements need to be there, interaction with non-like-minded needs to be there, and so on. So you can apply the same variables on also meso level, but meso state level as opposed to meso non-state level. But then if you want to sustain, you need to look one step up. So you need to look at how basically the political environment, as you noted, interstate activities, the incentives on the international level, and then at state level reforms, so security sector reform. If you hand over arms, are you going to trust the security sector? Are you going to trust the judicial sector to avoid any infringements on your rights? Is there a transitional justice process for the victims of both sides? Is there a balanced civil-military relations? So you balance the arms with laws and constitutions and laws. So you don't need to resort back to violence. And what happened if we clashed? And we will clash. Like these are very complicated and protracted, long conflicts. What happened if we clashed? Is there a conflict resolution mechanism that we can trust? So all this is like questions on a macro level, state to interstate level, that needs to be looked into deeply if you want to sustain this process. You can initiate it, you can initiate the process with just the 4 variables and sustain it for maybe for the short to mid-term. But for the long term, it will be much more complex than that. And then finally, you noted one point about the behavioral dimension of de-radicalization. So the people would behaviorally de-radicalize collectively. Stop using violence as a way to attain political and social objectives, but legitimate the violence ideologically, or use an ideology that either becomes or is non-moderate in a sense, so sectarian or misogynist or xenophobic, etc. But at the same time, they don't use violence. This actually, it's not just an Islamist phenomenon. This is beyond Islamism. So most of the individuals who belong to de-radicalized organizations, from groups like the FARC, the IRA, the ETA, even the PKK, the MK of the ANC back in South Africa, or the FMLN of El Salvador, or others who defected from these organizations. So either leaders within these organizations after the transformation, even led the transformation, or people who defected from these organizations. Most of them, I wouldn't say to have changed the ideology. The ideology is still upheld. And this is like, left-wing ideologies, ethno-nationalist ideology, and so on. Or elements of it, it's still upheld. But the behavior has changed. The organization completely changed. No more mortars, no more AK-47s, nothing. It's just a political party, a social movement. But the ideology is upheld. So in that case, like the exceptions would be something like the Islamic group of Egypt, for example. That's an exception in the sense that the ideology completely dismantled, and then they reproduced a new ideology. 15, 16, or over 20 maybe books and booklets to re-explain the new ideology. So that was the exception as opposed to the mainstream. Okay, I ran out of my time, and I don't want to give time for the discussion. So I will quickly move forward to Dr. Hassan Ubaid, who has a PhD in political science from the, excuse me if I mispronounce it, Duisburg-Essen University in Germany, and he has taken part in several conferences and published many articles about the Palestinian cause, and as well as Islamist movements. And he is currently focusing his research on Islamic and social movements and the role in democratic transitions. He co-authored the Palestinian refugees in the West Bank, the sustainability of life and determination to return. And without any further ado, I'll leave the floor to Dr. Hassan Ubaid.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Omar. Thank you, Dr. Hamzeh.
First of all, I think that it is important topic. and it is important to look at important theoretical framework, because I think that Dr. Hamzeh focused on theoretical framework to describe or to determine the factors for his dissertation or his presentation. I have 5 comments. First of all, I noticed that Dr. Hamzeh argued that or discussed the post-Islamism concept. I think that we need to describe what does it mean, post-Islamism. I think we need to determine the factors. For example, Asif Bayat, if you know the writer Asif Bayat, he discussed the post-Islamism before, I think that 20 years, and he described what does it mean, post-Islamism. But the main thing that he discussed, that the post-Islamism, that the Islamic movement that related with democracy and political process. But I think that when you talk about post-Islamism or your case study, 3 Islamic movements, I think we have big distance between the concept of post-Islamism and the 3 radicalization Islamic movement in your case study. So I will tell you another thing. For example, some literature discuss another concept, democratic Islamism. For example, the writers in Tunisia and Morocco discussed. They told us that we have another concept. We have another concept, not like post-Islamism, but democracy Islamism. And they argue that the democracy Islamism, that the Muslim Islamic movement depend democracy as a tool to reach the power or the regime. So my question, what is the definition for your post-Islamism, and what is the relation between post-Islamism concept and 3 Islamic case study? Another thing, we need to determine, I think that the difference between radical and not-radical movements. We need topology to describe what is this, what is the meaning of radical movement, and what is the meaning of not radical movement. I think it is topology. It is important to describe or to determine factors. If I want to describe this movement or another movement, it is radical or not radical, because as you mentioned, radicalization related with violence tools to reach the power, as I understand. But I think that we need to expand this concept to include another factors. For example, what is the position or for this Islamic movements or radical movement towards, for example, not using violence to reach the power. For example, to the minority rights, women rights. For the shape of the state, civil society. My question is, for example, we can consider, for example, Dawah Salafiyya in Egypt, radicalization movement or not? Muslim Brotherhood, radicalization, and Nahda in Tunisia. So we need to determine what is the meaning of the radicalization, not only using violence or not violence. For example, some or another movements didn't depend on violence to change the regime, but so for another thing, they demand certain norms or certain ideology toward women and minorities. Maybe we can consider this movement a radicalization movement. Another thing, or last thing, you mentioned at least maybe 5 or 6 theories to explain your presentation. I think that it is will face difficult to manage these theories. As I mentioned before, in my presentation, each theory has factors. Each theory has explanation, and you have 5 or 6 theories. How can you manage between all these theories to determine your question and factors and explanation for your study? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan, and thank you for also being sharp on time. Now I'll give Hamzeh about 10 minutes to reply back, and then I'll open to for the Q&A and comments and reactions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ashur and Dr. Hassan, for your valuable comments. I'm going to start with Dr. Hassan comments before because I'm totally agree with the most of Dr. Ashur comments. I'm going to take it in my consideration when I'm writing my dissertation. Well, let's start from the differentiation, the difference between Islamism and post-Islamism. Because there is uncertainty now, because I'm focusing on transformation under continuity, I'm not able now to determine if this movement will be moderate, will be de-radicalized, or maybe will get radicalized at the end of the day. Because the war in Syria haven't finished yet, and everything's still ongoing. We are in an ongoing process. So now I have chosen this term because it's helped me to expand the space, the scale. For example, what Asif Bayat said about post-Islamism. Post-Islamism does mean the Islamist movement or the Islamism has failed to attain a concrete result. So the Islamist movement try to adopt with the new modernity. For example, they try to aim a new modernity. They try to reshape their attitude without, for example, adopting democratic value. So they can participate. So here we can talk, Dr. Omar and the other scholars talk about what the difference between, for example, tactical de-radicalization, behavioral de-radicalization, and ideological and comprehensive de-radicalization, or what the difference between behavioral moderation and ideological moderation. If you want to say something comprehensive, it will be related to ideology. So that's why because most of our, not most, 2 cases of my selected cases have not right or try to deal with anything related to democracy process. Until now, they're talking about participation in negotiation, try to build a new state for all Syrians. But until now, for example, they have doubt about the concept of democracy. So that's why, in my opinion, now maybe it can be changed when I finish my dissertation. That the selected cases are in the situation is too close to post-Islamism more than Islamism, and not moderation, or, for example, not a political party. So this is why I meant. I totally agree with you about the importance of terminology. For example, I wrote in I sent 2 chapters that I wrote more than 3,000 words about the concept and the terms of my study. For example, I'm starting in defining radicalization from the radicalization came from radix, from roots, and how Karl Marx, for example, reproduced it. And for example, the radicals used in British context, for example, to explain the reformists in the British Parliament, and sometimes radical used everything against any actor against the state is considered as radical. So I differentiate in details between how the radical and between radicals and radicalism and radicalization also. Yeah, I used this is what I try to do, that's to engage with the theoretical framework. I'm not saying that this framework is bad or good. I'm trying to present how this framework is not suitable to my study. So political process approach, it's for example used to study radicalization since 1970, and they're used to study Islamist movement. Here we can shed the light on the Mustafa Hafiz book, why Muslim repeal, like the doctor, that's he firstly used this approach. But the problem or the special things about my case is that's I'm studying transformation under continuity, so I'm not studying complex cases, and most of transformation, and here we can move to Dr. Omar Ashur, that's happened after the military defeat. So here we have to focus about the different experience, global experience, not only in the Middle East, but only in but also in Ireland, North Ireland, and different countries as well, because most of transformation, especially behavior transformation, have occurred after the military defeat. And this is maybe could be, I can contribute theoretically to this issue within the Syrian case by focusing on the Syrian case. Yeah, I agree with you about we don't have any choice, other we have to study this movement by focusing on the three processes, although it's biased, but it's important. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Hamzeh. I just have one brief comment, and then I'll open to Q&A. I have some questions here, and then I will, after that, go back to you and give you the floor again for the last 5 minutes, 5-10 minutes. Very briefly, on the last point, it depends how we frame it, right? But empirically, so far, it's the majority of probably over, if I remember correctly, over 150 cases since the 1960s happened when there is a stalemate. So not defeat, stalemate. So a draw, basically. It's not an exact draw as in the state and the armed group are of the same level. Usually the armed group is much weaker, but manages to survive the state. And the state is like continuing the fighting is too costly. So this is when a hurting stalemate. Both sides are hurt, and both sides want to negotiate some form of an output. The last case is the FARC, basically in Colombia, FARC-EP. So the FARC-EP basically almost defeated since 2007 militarily, but they can continue. They can still fight. So then you go for the Cubans, and they negotiate a way out. Same thing with the Algerians, AIS, not the GIA. The GIA failed, but the AIS, the Islamic Salvation Army, they could have survived, but then they had the General Ismail Amari going up in the mountains and talking to them directly, and you had the nice pictures with Mizraq, smiling and so on, and then you negotiate a way out. As well, presidential decree saying, okay, we recognize the so-called Islamic Salvation Army, blah, blah. So in these cases, like, you see, the state was kind of had the upper hand militarily, but then continuing militarily is too costly, too bloody, get a way out. And same thing with the IRA, the MI5 basically infiltrated the guy who was vetting the new recruits. So, if the guy or the main institution that is vetting the new recruits to make sure that they're not working for the British intelligence is actually a British intelligence agent, when you go that deep into the organization, you really messed it up. But then continuing the fight, and after the mid-90s, continuing there was too costly for everybody. So then you negotiate and find a way out. So these kind of stalemates. But obviously you have many transformed under defeat. The most famous is the Comaros case in Uruguay, where you had, basically the Robin Hood guerrillas who used to rob banks, and they're proud of it. Speaking of changing ideology, until now you had the president José Mujica, elected twice, one of the leaders of the Comaros, elected twice, and comes out just his movie just came out recently, and he was saying, yeah, we robbed banks. You know, I'm totally okay with that. I don't think the bank should have charged anyone, or you shouldn't, you know, take basically put your money in a bank and then the bank charge you for using your own money. So basically, he's still upholding the ideology after being twice the president of Norway. So you can still do all of that under defeat, but also you can still do it under stalemate, and you can do it under victory. So the clearest case is that of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And also some call it, you know, the Ethiopian case, but you know, there's a debate that it's not exactly a democracy. But anyway, Sandinistas won by force, you know, won the fight to topple the regime. Actually tried to assassinate the leaders of the regime in another country in Paraguay. But then lost the election 3 times and handed over power. So that's a case to be taken as well into account. That obviously, you know, yeah, sure, please, yeah, please.
Maybe I used I misunderstood. Well, when I meant by military defeat that the 3 selected cases that they are aware now they cannot win they cannot win the battle by military tools.
Yeah.
They have developed, for example, a survival strategy, at least since the Russian intervention in 2015 until now, and they are still the most powerful and the most best organized local Islamist group in the opposition and the Syrian opposition.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, that's it. You know, the realization. This is part of also the costs of the armed path. Like you can put it under. I used the term state repression, but it was not the most accurate one. Mostly the costs of the armed path, because after that other literature I wrote, I was revising this particular issue, but the costs are high, and even on the regime side, it's high as well. Like, you know, if they're rational, not very rational, but if they are rational, the costs are too high to continue. So then you find a way out, and then if you found a rational leader on the regime side as well. You negotiate. Tony Blair did it. De Klerk did it in South Africa, and so on and so forth. So you find a way out just to avoid the human cost and the economic costs as well. Okay. So and then one last quick bit on the liberal democracy. The moderation issue. Obviously, it's a liberal democratic bias. You know, you measure moderation on how much do you accept liberal democracy and its tenets. If you reject constitutional liberalism, then you're not a moderate. So I used to tell my colleagues back in the 2000s, you know, when I started this, we have to realize that we are an ideology. You know, we are a worldview. So, you know, we're judging others on whether they like it's a humane worldview. Like I still believe that liberal democracy is a very humane and human-centric worldview. But we are still a worldview. So, you know, judging others by our own worldview does not really, you know, we have to realize this at least. Maybe it is the right way to go, but we have to realize that we are an opinion. We are a worldview, and accordingly, you know, the definition is biased. We either accept that it's biased or say something about it. So just over to you if you want to say something about this.
I totally agree. I wrote about this also when I defined moderation. That's sometimes moderation is controversial to define moderation. For example, some studies define moderation by accepting Israel. Not only liberal democracy, but some scholars define moderation by, for example, the position toward women, and now toward homosexuality. So we have a lot of factors to measure the moderation. That's why it's very controversial. Not only moderation, and also participation is controversial. For example, why only participation in an election? So we have different kind of participation. In my theoretical part, I wrote everything's about. I think I wrote almost because I'm really interested in this issue, because I wrote almost 3,000 words about this issue. Again, my introductory and my theoretical part, just to take in my account that this issue is very, very, very controversial, and until now we didn't protect our knowledge until now about this issue. Maybe it's an occasion, for example, to have you have a contribution in this issue, but maybe it's good for the Arab student and the scholar to contribute more about this issue, at least to balance the Western narrative or the Western approaches in this issue. Until now, there is no global knowledge regarding to how to study. It's Western knowledge only. So that's why it's our opportunity to do that. And we know about the region and about the details, and we can, for example, care about the context, sociopolitical context, and that would be our contribution from the cases.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you very much. This is the part of the mission of the Arab Center and the Doha Institute. So let's hope we contribute to the large body of Western knowledge. Okay, I have a few questions here, so I'm going to read them. First from Yazid Zahda. I have noticed that you have a mix of theories that has made the presentation a bit confusing. So we need to somehow reconcile these theories. And if you can elaborate more on your results. I guess you did not finish the PhD, so just basically your hypotheses until they become results. So the message also about what is the message to the audience? This is like a very long paragraph, but the core of it is what is the message to the audience that you want to convey. And how much do you think? So, and then finally, so you used rational choice, and at the end of the presentation, how much do you think that this theory, given the economic factors, could sustain a radical group's position with the least costs and more benefits? So, less costs and more benefits. Okay, so this is one, and then there is a question in Arabic, so I'm going to read it in Arabic and then translate, and excuse my translation in advance.
I can ask also a question.
Sorry? هل حقا يمكن اعتبار أن ما يميز المجموعات الثلاث موضوع البحث هو كونها حركات سورية بدون ارتباطات دولية في حين أن التيارات السلفية هي بالضرورة تظهر basically if these three movements are distinctively Syrian, is that basically what makes them distinct or distinguished without having any external relations? But yeah, the whole question needs to be rephrased. Okay, so yeah, this is basically three there, and I'll give you back the floor.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm confused as well because I use a lot of theories. So, but usually when because I'm still focusing on theoretical contribution and what the proper way and what the best way to study Islamist transformation within Islamist movement in Syria. So that's why I have highlighted the main or the most theoretical approaches that used to study Islamist movement. And just to say that in my chapter, I said because my theoretical framework is to try to avoid shortcoming and limitation in the literature, not only in the literature, because, for example, in my thesis, there's two literature on Syria, that's the literature that studied the Islamist movement in Syria and where the gap, And the second literature is the theoretical approaches that used to study Islamist movement. And I have it chosen this framework just to fill the gap and to avoid the shortcoming of these approaches. So that's why I used a lot of things, and this is the scholarly engagement. One of our mission as a scholar and as a student to highlight the literature, to at least to say what you are gonna to contribute or something like that. About the economic, in the second part of my second dimension of my theoretical framework, focusing on resources mobilization theory, or RMT. That's I'm focusing here about, as I said, about pre-war network and the economic network, and especially in rural area. And this network this networks was linked with, for example, Iraq and Lebanon, and the jihadist movement in Iraq and Lebanon. And also after the revolution, I'm talking about the sponsorship, about the state sponsorship, and also about the diaspora contribution in financing the Islamist movement in Syria, and how that's affect about their passes toward radicalization or not. And regarding to local Islamist movement, as I said, and the trend in the Syrian study that most of the Western scholars focus on Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS. Nobody, for example, studied Faylaq al-Sham or Jaysh al-Islam. Many policy paper or something. This can be understandable because the main interest why the global jihadist movement put a threat on the international order, and that's why a scholar, because they want to offer a political recommendation how to deal with this movement, they focus on global jihadist movement rather than or at the expense of local movement. But because I'm Syrian, and because one of transformation for Ahrar al-Sham, for example, happened in Sinai prison, when Ahrar al-Sham or the Salafist and the Salafi jihadist leader decide to be national, with no links with Al-Qaeda. So that's why Ahrar al-Sham, it's a new school, it's a new current in the Salafi jihad. It's too close to Taliban, but it's not the same, because Taliban has the official link with Al-Qaeda, or at least has a cooperation, although it's local character or something like that. So yeah, I'm trying to focus on local, because they don't have any national, non-institutional or non-organizational. I use non-organizational. Yeah, theoretically or identially or ideologically, they have link. Yeah, the Wahhabism, for example, located in Saudi Arabia, Salafi jihadism, it's extended from the Morocco to the Gulf. So, but I'm talking about the organization here rather than about this issue. I forgot the last question. I'm sorry. I forgot the last question. Maybe in Arabic or the. Well, about the audience, the message of the audience. I'm not trying. I am in academic conference now, because I'm trying to discuss with the scholar now, because I'm focused on theoretical part. So maybe when I finish my dissertation, maybe I'm gonna say much better about this issue. Maybe after 1 year or 1 year and a half, something like that.
Okay, very, very humble of you. And now I'll move to two other quick questions from Ilyas Saeed. He's basically asking if there is a Shiite political Islam, and do they represent case studies in political Islam in Syria as well. That's one thing. And then Hal he's asking, well, I guess a bit off the topic question, but if Iran represent an Islamic democratic model, and how does it compare to Syria, and how does the Turkish model, Islamic democratic, and the Malaysian model, Islamic democratic ones, relate to the Syrian case? Mainly because, in the Malaysian case, for example, the Malaysian case, there's a diversity of races, ethnicities, and so on. And yeah, I don't know if Dr. Musa Alaya has a question as well. Welcome, Dr. Musa.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for the very interesting presentation, Hamza. Really a good subject. I like it very much, and also Dr. Omar Ashur for your managing this meeting. Actually, I'm mostly my concern is about the non-violent actors, or the non-violent movements, and I think it will be very interesting for you to focus not just only in the violent, but also try how to also focus in the non-violent movements in Syria or in other places, and you try is about what activities the non-violent social movement undertake during the war in Syria, and how do non-violent social movement understand the non-violence, especially in relation to the violent tools of other violent actors. I think these two questions are very important, and to focus on them in future, and to also be partly of your thesis. I think they are very, very important, and just only not to focus only to the violent actors, but also on the non-violent actors. I think this is the this is the platform how to also build into the peace building approach in Syria or in other cases. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The floor is mine.
Thank you very much. Yes, Dr. Hamza, back to you. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, there's a shared policies in Syria, but I'm not sure that there's a shared political Islam movement in Syria. But maybe if Iran continue its policy in Syria, maybe we will have in the future. Because now Iran tried to establish a new sectarian bodies outside the state, like in Iraq, but the demographic character of Syria is different on Iraq, so it's difficult mission, I think. But about the models, about the Iranian and about Turkey, for example, this one, when I discussed Islamism, the term of Islamism, that's in my opinion, or my argument, that's and I share with many scholars on this issue, that the Islamism, it's a modern phenomena. It's related about the discussion about the relation with the nation state. So how to Islamizing the nation state, especially after 50s, it's became one of factors that determine the concept of Islamism. So the Iranian state after the revolution, one of these models, for example, the Saudi Arabia as a modern state or as a nation state combined with the Islamic ideology, also one of the model, one model that affect in the perception of the Islamism in general. Thank you, Dr. Alaya, for this question. And this is different topic, but in my topic, for example, I'm trying to understand why this movement, who consider as a violent actor, participate in non-violent activism during 2011, during the first year. For example, the Salafists, although they not accept the democracy and the freedom or the dignity and the slogan of the Syrian revolution, but they participate. They participated in the protests, in the uprising, and under the slogan of the, and how, for example, there is a fatwa from Osama bin Laden, you know, about this issue, about that you can participate. The model of al-Nusra, it's emerged after the Arab Spring in the discussion about which better, violent methods or non-violent methods. So I'm consider about this discussion and how contributed to the emergence of the Islamist movement in Syria, especially in 2011, 2012. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Hamzeh and Dr. Hassan. If there are no other questions, I think there's nothing more. I will have to conclude this session, and thank you again. I look forward to reading this dissertation and reading it as well in print, hopefully in Arabic and English, and other languages. Maybe, you never know. It's relevant to everybody at the moment, since almost everyone else is involved in Syria at the moment. And I have to also remind our audience, ladies and gents, of the tomorrow's sessions, which include linguistics, gender, and comparative literature. So I would like to just remind you to join us and register on the Arab Center's website for these sessions. We talked a bit about armed and unarmed confrontations, so these are relatively light session, comparative literature and so on. So on the peace side. So I'll leave you with that, and have a very good evening or morning, wherever you are, and we shall be in touch to continue tomorrow morning.
Thank you.